Thank you for joining us to this second to last talk of this first edition of the CIVICA Data Science Seminar Series. So my name is Nicolo Cavalli. I am an assistant professor at Bocconi University. It's one of the founding institutions of the CIVICA network, and I will be the moderator of this talk. So today we are particularly excited to have a talk by Chris Bade, who is the founder and director of the Polarization Lab at Duke University, where he is a professor of sociology and public policy. Chris's research on political tribalism, extremism, and social psychology, which he conducts using social media data and tools from the emerging field of computational social science, has been published in leading international journals such as Science, PNAS, the American Sociological Review, the American Journal of Sociology, the American Journal of Public Health, among others. And now insights from this body of work are collected in a new book, his second book, titled Breaking the Social Media Prism, How to Make Our Platforms Less Polarizing, published in April by Princeton University Press. So in the book, which I personally found as kind of thought-provoking, as easy to read, which is kind of a rare combination, Chris takes talks on the broader literature on social media and polarization, and also discusses real-world implications on how we can counter political tribalism and redesign social media platforms for a better use. And there will be time to discuss also these policy implications at the end of this talk. So this is all very exciting, which means it's time for me to yield the floor. Before I do that though, just one small housekeeping announcement. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A box that is a feature of the Zoom interface. And I'll read them out loud at the end of Chris's talk. So now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Chris, and really thank you for being here with us today. Looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Okay, grazie mille, Nicolo, and thank you everybody for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. I haven't been to the LSE in a few years. I think it's been 2 or 3 years, and had a great time the last time I visited. And of course, I wish I could be there in person, but so grateful to have the time to share with you all today. My new book, Breaking the Social Media Prism. So as Nicolo mentioned, this book is really out to try to explain the relationship between social media and political polarization. And we can define political polarization in a lot of different ways. And for some time, people have really looked at 2 different kinds of political polarization. One is issue-based, or sometimes called ideological polarization. This refers to people's tendency to take different positions on social policy issues, such as immigration or climate change. But then there's another kind of polarization, which is often called affective polarization. And this refers to people's tendency to have negative attitudes towards the other party, independent of that party's policy ideas. And in the US, scholars have been debating whether or not different types of ideological polarization are on the rise. But there's, I think, emerging consensus that affective polarization has reached a really concerning level. And of course, this is a very international crowd, so I should apologize at the outset for a talk that's going to principally focus on the US. And of course, it's very interesting to note that these trends are not uniform across all countries. We've got countries like Germany where polarization is actually going down. So there's bigger macro historical questions that we would need to look at to solve the puzzle of where polarization comes from. But for the time being, one of the more concerning data points is this one right here, which some colleagues and I reported in a recent article. And I point to this part of the graph in particular because it shows that somewhere around 2012, Americans began to hate the other party more than they approve of their own party on this kind of feeling thermometer scale, which ranges from 0 to 100, which is kind of standard way that a large survey of the American electorate measures this kind of affective polarization. And of course, that sets off alarm bells because, you know, we see evidence of, you know, political tribalism, or we even called it in this paper political sectarianism, to underscore the, you know, the strength of this animus between parties, and also their apparent inability to find compromise and work together. So of course, you know, around 2012, the other big development in the world was, of course, social media is really coming online for the first time to a large degree. And so many people became concerned about social media echo chambers and wondered whether they are increasing political polarization. So here we're looking at some Twitter data. These are US elected officials. The blue nodes here describe Democrats and the red nodes describe Republicans, and the lines between them describe whether they're following each other on Twitter. So we see the same kind of clustering by political beliefs, no matter whether we look at politicians or journalists or activists. And the concern, of course, is that, or news organizations, and the concern, of course, is that this type of clustering can create a kind of myopia. You know, we maybe fail to recognize that there's two sides to every story, or we maybe fail to effectively humanize the other side, or we're really just listening to different stories altogether. And I think for me and many other people around 2017, after the Brexit referendum and the somewhat surprising election of President Trump, the idea of social media echo chambers provided a pretty convenient explanation for what had happened. Those of us who were surprised by those events were simply on one side, and the other side had been obscured by social media, either by our human tendency to follow like-minded people, or by our or by algorithms which may, for example, reinforce that human tendency. So in 2018, some colleagues and I set up the Polarization Lab that Nicolo mentioned at Duke University. I co-direct this with the political scientist Sunshine Hilligas and the statistician Alexander Wolfowski. And our mission was really both to develop high quality research to study the links between social media and political polarization, but also to develop public tools that real people could use to try to counter political tribalism online. And so one of the very first ideas we had was to ask whether you know, we should break people out of these echo chambers. Again, around 2018, I think this was probably the prevailing explanation of how social media might be polarizing us. I should say that personally, I think it's hard to answer that question of whether social media polarizes us because there aren't very useful counterfactuals. It's hard to imagine a world where there wasn't social media. And you know, there's so many other, again, comparative historical factors that got us to where we are today. Things like the rise of cable news, you know, the various political strategies of different parties, and probably macro historical events, maybe even the fall of the Soviet Union. Who knows? But the question that we began our work with was, you know, given that social media doesn't seem to be making things better, how can we try to study how much polarization happens because of social media echo chambers? And so the idea, of course, is if you broke people out of their echo chambers in this kind of idealized cartoon here, they might be able to take off their party identity, you know, the elephant here describing the Republicans and the donkey describing the Democrats, and be able to have a conversation independent of their kind of policy beliefs. Nigel, I see some questions in the Q&A. I just wanted to make sure that nobody has a clarifying question before I go on here. I can't see them easily while I'm sharing my screen, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the question it was Joanna Bryson was asking if social media take off around 2007 with the smartphone. This
I see.
was referred to. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, you know, that's a loose comparison. You know, I would say, you know, the height of popularity of Facebook is, of course, many years after. It was just a rough kind of comparison. Yeah. Is that the only question?
Yes, for now.
Okay.
Then there was a clarification, but we can I can interrupt in case there are clarifying questions.
Okay. Thanks. I'll just I'll just count on you to interrupt it.
Exactly.
Thanks, Nicola.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, we were asking this question: why not try to break people out of their echo chambers if echo chambers are indeed responsible for the polarization that we think we're seeing online? Now, the challenge, of course, is that studying the relationship between echo chambers and political polarization raises a lot of methodological challenges. It could be that our social media networks are shaping our political views, but it could also be that our political views are determining how we put together our social media networks, who we follow, and so on. And so what you'd ideally want to do, we thought, is some type of experiment to get around this circular causality in this question. And so in 2017, we launched a survey where we queried about 1,200 Republicans and Democrats about their political views using something called the Ideological Consistency Index, which has been used in 16 large national surveys of Americans to try to place people on a scale that ranges from liberal to conservative, very liberal to very conservative. We asked them a series of other questions as well about their media consumption habits and demographic attributes, all sorts of things like that. We only studied people who use Twitter, and we only studied US citizens who are over 18 who identified with either the Republican or Democratic Party. So we're not studying independents, we're not studying non-Twitter users. About a week after we did this initial survey, we sent people a seemingly unrelated invitation to earn up to $24 for quote unquote following a bot or automated Twitter account that would retweet 24 messages each day. We didn't tell people what the bot would retweet, but the bot retweeted 24 messages each day from opinion leaders from the other party, so politicians, journalists, media organizations, and other types of prominent political figures. I'll talk a little bit more about how we chose those figures in just a minute. Then during the month in which half of the people in the study were following these bots and the other half were not, the people who were following the bots were sent weekly surveys to try to monitor whether they were paying attention to what the bot was retweeting, so that we could detect kind of how compliant people were with the treatment that we were trying to give them, which was to kind of in effect step outside their echo chamber. At the end of the month, we sent them the same survey, and we calculated the change in their position on the liberal conservative scale over 1 month. And that's kind of the main finding I'll describe in just a minute. So in order to simulate people or find a way to take people outside their echo chamber, we designed bots that leveraged a network-based sampling technique developed by Pablo Barbera, who probably some of you know, because he was at LSE not so long ago. And in this approach, essentially, one scrapes the names of elected officials and presidential candidates, which in our case yielded a network of about 660,000 nodes. And then we exclude anyone who's not followed by at least 10 elected officials. So this allows us to capture that, for example, Hillary Clinton follows CNN, but not that Hillary Clinton follows her niece. And these are the type of things that we see. Sorry, just a minute here. That we see, trying to approximate the full range of ideological perspectives from the opposing party. So we take a much smaller network, which consists of about 4,000 nodes, and we use correspondence analysis and principal component analysis to create a single unidimensional scale, which ranges from very liberal to very conservative, based upon patterns in who follows who across the political spectrum. So people who follow mostly Democrats are near this side of the continuum. People who follow mostly Republicans or are connected to or followed by mostly Republicans are on this side of the continuum. Then each hour, the bot drew randomly a name from each distribution. And if that name had tweeted in the previous hour, it retweeted that message. So we didn't really have much control over what the bots tweeted. We simply allowed them to retweet messages from about 4,000 different opinion leaders each hour. In order to monitor whether people were paying attention to these bots, each day the bot would retweet one of these three messages, one of these three pictures. And at the end of the week, we sent everyone in the treatment condition a survey to ask whether they were able to identify one of these cute animals that had been being tweeted the week prior. We deleted the tweets that contained the animals prior to this survey. We also took some other steps to measure whether people were paying attention to the substance of the tweets as well. So now I'll show you the effect of following these bots for 1 month. Again, our hope was that by taking people outside their echo chamber, they might show some moderation. Liberals might become a little less liberal, and conservatives might become a little less conservative. And so what I'll show you here is the results for Republicans and Democrats separately, because they were essentially part of different experiments where they're following different bots, but then also according to different levels of compliance. So how many of the questions about the cute animals and the content of the bot's tweets that people were able to answer. And what you see, unfortunately, is no evidence of moderation. Democrats did not move in the conservative direction or the less liberal direction, and Republicans did not move in the liberal direction. This, by the way, I know for international audiences, the term liberal can be a little confusing here. I'm using it in the American sense to describe the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. But what we see essentially is that Democrats, especially those who were able to answer all of our questions, exhibited small but statistically insignificant increases in liberal attitudes on our 10-item liberal to conservative index that includes questions about things like climate change, racial injustice, economic inequality, and so on. But Republicans who followed the Democratic bot, and especially those who really paid attention to the bot, exhibited substantial increases in conservatism. This is about a standard deviation increase, which is a pretty sizable increase in the landscape of social science field experiments, I think it's fair to say. If you want to read more about this article, it's available on polarizationlab.com. And there's a lot more to the methods that I'd be happy to discuss in the Q&A. But most of what I would love to talk to you today about is kind of why I think this happened and what I think it means for the path out of political tribalism on social media. So initially, we thought we had a pretty good shot at answering this question of why this is happening. We had some pretty neat data. We had survey data that was linked to behavioral data collected from Twitter. We had daily slices of each respondent's network. We had the full text of everything they had tweeted or liked or commented upon on Twitter. And, this was kind of 2017, or a lot of new techniques for analyzing texts that had just come online, or not just come online, but were becoming prominent and used broadly to try to examine mechanisms in these types of experiments. And we threw everything we had at these data. Every natural language processing tool, every tool for detecting heterogeneous treatment effects, every tool for causal inference with machine learning, and again we came up empty-handed. We saw the consistent effect across all different subgroups. We were able to look at the content of the bot's tweets and rule out asymmetries in the types of content they had been tweeting. We saw some suggestive evidence that maybe people were expressing more emotional language over time when they were exposed to the bots. But this is a very, fragile effect, in part because very few people tweet and most people kind of lurk or just read tweets. So it was we couldn't really do as much as we might have liked with the data. So after about 4 months of, really experimenting with every possible angle on the data we could think of. And by the way, if you'd like to experiment with the data, it's available on the Harvard Dataverse, linked on my website, chrisbale.net. We couldn't figure it out. So what we did is we decided we needed to do another study. And our first impulse was to try to go back and maybe do some analysis of individuals in the first study, maybe recontact them and survey them, or maybe interview them. But we realized pretty quickly that it would be difficult to get any kind of meaningful explanation from people themselves, because we know so well that people tend to provide post hoc or kind of ad hoc explanations of their behavior. And we know there's a massive gap between attitudes and behavior, and that some of this effect could be subconscious or implicit. Furthermore, we were asking people at the time to reflect on an experience they had had 6 months earlier. And if you asked me to, describe why I liked or changed my attitude about something I saw on social media 6 months ago, I personally would have a really hard time doing it, given the kind of blooming, buzzing confusion of social media. So what we did instead was to reconduct the experiment, but this time, instead of using survey methods, we conducted a qualitative field experiment. So instead of surveying people with an online instrument, we interviewed them for 1 to 2 hours before and after they followed the bot. And the goal here was to try to take the perspective of the individuals in the experiment as they were experiencing this treatment. So when we first spoke with them, we used an open-ended but semi-structured interview schedule where we asked them a series of questions about how they first started using social media and why, asked them to describe some recent experiences they had on social media, kind of what they were up to on social media. We gradually began to ask them political questions. We asked them versions of the questions that were included in our liberal to conservative index. And we also asked them a series of questions about their understanding of current events. So this was, events in the news at this time were things like the Camp Fire, the largest forest fire in California's history, the caravan of migrants that had amassed at the US-Mexico border in 2008, largely from Guatemala and El Salvador. And then also the murder of an African-American security guard who was in pursuit of a criminal, and the alleged execution of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post Germany, by Turkey. So there are a lot of events, and we were able to, because we had treatment and control conditions, explore how people who were exposed to the bots for 1 month were kind of understanding these events. Were they taking, different perspectives on these events because they were, being exposed to the other side? And in my book, I describe a lot of case studies and individual experiences that provide a lot of detailed explanation, as qualitative, data is wont to do, about how this happened. But because I'd like to get to one more field experiment and describe some of the public solutions in this talk, I'll simply have to condense it into one slide here. And basically what we discovered through this qualitative field experiment is that we have, I think, the wrong model of how social media shapes our attitudes. The model that we have, I think, is imported from people like Habermas or John Stuart Mill, and the idea is essentially that, if we expose ourselves to a more diverse set of views, this will provoke introspection and reappraisal of our pre-existing views, and we will depolarize. We will essentially, social media creates a competition of ideas, and the social media echo chamber prevents the competition of ideas, and that's to the detriment of everyone. And if only we could talk to each other, we could share information, and we would, like good Bayesians, adapt our priors, and be able to to see that there's two sides to every story. But what was most striking about our qualitative research is that there was almost no discussion of information at all. So nobody talked about the content of policy ideas in the tweets, or nobody said things like, yeah, I can see how the other side has a point on X, when they were exposed to, say, moderates on the other side. So the liberal people in our study were not talking about center-right people like David Brooks or Stephen Bullock, the centrist governor of the state of Montana. Instead, they were focusing on the more extreme attacks by more extreme members of the other party. So liberals focused upon attacks by people like Ted Cruz. Republicans focused on people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the kind of up-and-coming far left leader in the US. And what we discovered is that taking people outside of their echo chamber didn't really diversify their information environment. Instead, it seemed to expose them more fully to the partisan warfare that many of us know well from spending time on social media. And so instead of provoking introspection and reappraisal, this exposure to counter-attitudinal messaging created increased identity salience. So even among people who didn't care much about politics, we discovered people suddenly engaging in political dialogue online, in part because we think they experienced assaults on their party as an assault on themselves. And I think that also underscores the depth of political sectarianism in the US, that people have become to focus on experiences or threats against their side as a kind of personal threat. And so there we see this elaborated identity defense. People they use information as kind of ammunition in this identity-based warfare, instead of the other way around. So instead of a competition of ideas, I argue that social media is really more of a competition of our identities. And if we want to understand how to defeat polarization on social media, we need to understand how social media is shaping our identities. And for any sociologists who are listening, this is a kind of a core question in sociology, and one that fits nicely with a model that is known outside of sociology as social learning, but within sociology, you might call it the looking glass self, or Goffman's dramaturgy. And basically the idea here is that, every day, knowingly or unknowingly, we present different versions of ourselves. I can be a college professor in one context, a father in another context, or a avid reader in another context. And then we search for clues in our social environment about which types of presentations of self are resonating with others and which ones give us a sense of social status or give us a sense of self-worth. Then we tend to cultivate those presentations of self that improve our self-esteem and self-worth, and avoid those that do not. This is a kind of tried and true finding across sociology, social psychology, and several adjacent fields like cognitive science. And the really interesting question that I think is the deepest sociological question is, how does the social environment shape this process of social learning? So in other words, how does our ability to scan our social environment shape the type of identities that we cultivate? And here, I think the really interesting question about social media is, how has it changed this human process? I mean, first of all, we know that all of us are very bad at reading social environments. We tend to misunderstand what other people think of us, even long before social media. But I think social media has changed the process of social learning in two fundamental ways. The first is that it gives us unprecedented flexibility to present different versions of ourselves. So we can be, in many, many contexts, fully anonymous to each other, or we could be someone completely altogether different, or we can describe every detail of our lives. Second, social media has given us more efficient ways of monitoring what other people think of us, things like follower counts and like buttons. Now, of course, those tools are not a perfect approximation of what people in general think of us. They're what the kind of social media world thinks of us. But increasingly, especially among young people, we saw in our data that there is a real strong impetus to treat that social feedback as meaningful clues about which type of identities are working or not working. So in the aggregate, what this means is that social media is creating kind of a prism-like effect, where we want to use social media as kind of a giant mirror to understand whether people think about us or society in general. We want to use social media as a litmus test for public opinion. But when we start to break things down, what we see is that about 6% of all Twitter users are prolific political tweeters. But they generate about 20% of all tweets and 73% of tweets mentioning national politics. And of course, the strange thing about that's a little concerning in general when you think about it. It's not so dissimilar from what we know about political communication and political knowledge in the general public in general. But what's concerning, I think, is that small minority of people making most of the noise have fairly extreme views. They tend to be either in the extreme liberal or extreme conservative category. And so what this means is that social media, I think, has really hastened what is often called false polarization, are our tendency to confuse extremists on the other side with moderates on the other side, leaving all of us feeling much more polarized than we really are. And so in the book, I talk a lot about how this type of distortion happens. And I talk about a lot of the kind of motivations for people to talk about social media, talk about politics on social media. So for example, I discuss the case of extremists. There's a chapter on extremists and kind of what motivates extremists. And here, I tell the story of people who in our interview data are perfectly civil, polite, even deferential, go out of their way to decry incivility online. And in particular, a conservative man who we interviewed sticks in my memory, who said something like, all these people who argue online are just losers who live with their parents. And then when we went to merge the interview data with the behavioral data we collected from Twitter through a seemingly unrelated research dialogue, what we discovered is people like this guy undergo a Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde style transformation each night, and are actually some of the most prolific political trolls that we saw in the study. And meme after meme, is created by folks like this guy every night on Photoshop. He's a conservative individual, and so a lot of his memes were attacking people like Barack Obama, exhibiting a lot of the racial themes that he in the qualitative interview decried. And so this really interesting question arises, I think, why do people become such different people online and off? And I think this story about social learning provides a really promising explanation, especially when we start to look at the social context of people in their offline lives. So extremists, I came to discover in the course of this research, tend to be social outcasts in their offline lives. So this individual that I was just describing, for example, is a strong conservative who lives in a liberal state and works in a liberal profession, but also has very low social status. In fact, even though he was making fun of people for living with his mother, it turns out, according to some detective work with our social media data, we were able to discover that he, in fact, lives with his mom. So, there's this kind of status seeking among social outcasts that I think drives a lot of the extremism on social media. And even though many people might question whether the kind of micro celebrity that trolls can achieve has any value, for trolls themselves, our interview data suggests it has very high value, and people are very motivated to seek status, especially when they lack status in their offline lives. So then the interesting question is, okay, well, that might explain some of the extremists, but I'm not suggesting that all of us have the potential to engage in political trolling. In fact, the much larger part of the population just disengages from politics altogether on social media. And so an equally important question is to ask, why do people disengage from discussions of politics on social media? Now, again, we know that in the general population, most people don't talk about politics very often. So it's not as if, it's something completely unique to social media. But what's unique about social media, I think, is that conversations that once could be kind of controlled in a small group context now have the potential to reach many more people. So people who engage in political discussions risk being victimized by trolls from the other party or their own party, often in kind of horrific ways. So in the book, I describe a woman whose children were threatened online, and the Pew Research Center actually just recently published a report which suggests the #1 reason Americans are harassed online is for expressing their political views. But also getting back to this point about social status and this being the key kind of motivating factor for our political behavior online, many moderates derive status from other places besides social media. They have jobs that they care about. They have families that could be compromised, family relationships that could be compromised for voicing political views online. In other words, talking about politics probably carries more risk in the minds of most of these people than has potential payoff. And so the net effect is that we see this preponderance of extremists, and well, moderates are largely disengaging. And again, this kind of sets this process of false polarization into hyperdrive. That is our tendency to exaggerate the ideological extremity of people on the other side, and also minimize the ideological extremity of people on our side, because we're exposed to a more diverse range of people on our side than we tend to be on the other side. And since I completed this research, even more data is starting to bear this out. In fact, a recent survey indicates that as many as 89% of moderate Republicans have never or very rarely posted about politics online. Now, that isn't a perfect data point. There's probably some measurement error there, but overall, I think it underscores the problem that social media has created perverse incentives for status-seeking social outcasts to engage in extreme trolling, and well, the rest of the moderate people whose views are much more representative disengage. And so, in the final few chapters of the book, I try to propose some solutions to kind of simultaneously mute extremists and boost moderates. And the first thing I kind of argue is that, many of us, I think, are content to sit back and blame social media platforms for this problem and say, well, Facebook is profiting from, these types of status seeking arrangements. They're getting more clicks and so on and so forth. And I certainly think that social media platforms deserve a healthy amount of blame for our current situation. But I also worry that if we wait for them to magically turn some type of mythical dial deep inside their source code to fix polarization, we're going to be surprised by how much of polarization comes from our own behavior, our own instincts to engage in partisan warfare online, like the ones I described earlier. In other words, I think we need to think about bottom-up solutions, not just top-down solutions. So one way I think we can achieve this is to create more knowledge about false polarization on social media. So help people identify political trolls, learn how what they say in their tweets it makes other people think about their politics. So these tools are trained on our linked survey data to Twitter data and allow Twitter users in the US, unfortunately the tools are only trained on US data, to estimate whether the people that they're interacting with might be political trolls through language analysis, through demographic features, and also to develop more introspection about how their own behavior, maybe lack of engagement, is contributing to the problem of false polarization by comparing how their political views look online to how they look offline using these kind of quiz tools. So these are tools to help promote introspection among social media users. I don't think they're going to discourage trolls from trolling, of course, but maybe help the moderate people who are mistaking trolls as representative of the other side understand that they're dealing with a tiny minority of the population of the other side. So the first kind of bottom-up prescription in the book is to help people learn to see this social media prism, learn to see how the false polarization process distorts our understanding of the political landscape. But in addition to avoiding extremists, I also think it's really important that we boost moderation and increase new forms of status attached to bipartisanship. So right now, if you think about the landscape of a place like Twitter, there's almost no incentive to engage in moderate behavior. If you look at someone like Liz Cheney, the Republican member of Congress, who was recently ousted from her leadership position for criticizing Trump in what is not a terribly moderate position, but a somewhat moderate position. This is the way that people like her or Ben Sass or other types of moderates tend to be treated on social media. They tend to get attacked. So the idea of our social media bipartisanship leaderboard is to use our opinion leader data and our linked panel of Twitter users and derive for each of the opinion leaders a score that describes how much their tweets resonate or are liked by people from both parties instead of just one party. So you can visit all these tools, by the way, on polarizationlab.com if you want to check them out. We also realized that we could build bots that would retweet people from the bipartisanship leaderboard in another attempt to kind of boost moderation on the platforms and create a kind of sense of status or something that could be desirable to pursue moderation on social media. Finally, there's tools that track hashtags that seem to be mentioned by both Republicans and Democrats and seem to be being discussed in the same ways, and also allow folks to explore their echo chamber. Unfortunately, most of these tools only work with Twitter because Facebook doesn't allow us to build apps that do stuff like this. Okay, so I think one very underappreciated source of political polarization is fundamental human instinct to improve our sense of self-worth, and these tools are designed to try to change the incentive structure from the bottom up. But of course, we also, I think, need to think about top-down solutions. We are, after all, in an environment where people are rewarded for posting increasingly extreme content. Their content is boosted because most newsfeed algorithms tend to optimize for engagement. In principle, and one of the prescriptions I make in the book is that newsfeed algorithms could optimize for bipartisan appeal, or even appeal across any number of political divides outside politics. And in this way, by conveniently aggregating information that resonates across social divides, social media could actually optimize for better democratic discourse instead of for preaching to the choir, which is essentially how I think it's currently set up. But the other bigger problem for researchers, like so many of us on this call, is that figuring out what works from the top down is not easy. We can't easily manipulate core features of social media platforms in order to discover which ones are polarizing. We can't simply waltz into Facebook and say, hey, would you please change the filter bubble today by 32%, or would you please add a new feature that allows people to become anonymous or something like that. These are unfeasible because of, well, a number of controversies related to academic research on social media platforms, but also legal issues, public relations issues. And after all, these are corporations that have a responsibility to protect the experience of their users. And therefore, it's very difficult to experiment upon the core features of social media that may or may not shape our behavior and create these kind of perverse incentive structures that I've described. And this is too bad because not enough people are asking questions about, how the design of social media platforms shapes our behavior. We've been too content, in my view, to accept platforms like Facebook, which of course was originally designed to help Harvard undergraduates rate each other's physical attractiveness, serve as the kind of primary forum for, democratic discourse. It's like simply ridiculous that we've been content to accept the chaotic and largely ad hoc evolution of the platform into this role. Or, if you like Instagram, originally designed to facilitate alcohol-based gatherings, Twitter, originally designed to help friends more efficiently send text messages to each other. All of these platforms were not designed using principles that we know might incentivize better human behavior. So that was all a long-winded way of saying that I think we academics need to develop new ways of studying social media and conducting experiments on these kind of core features, and that the most high-value science will require actually creating our own environments for social research, because the research is just not possible on existing platforms. And so one of the things that we did in the Polarization Lab over the past 2 or 3 years is to create a simulated social media platform for academic research. So this is a tool that in principle, any researcher could use to spin up a social media platform with different types of features and control different types of features, turn them on and off in different types of experimental settings to try to isolate what types of changes could change our behavior. In this first study that I described in the last chapter of the book on this new platform, we wanted to study anonymity. And the reason we wanted to study anonymity is kind of, it can be thought of as a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, anonymity can allow people to say things online that they would never say in real life, and that has obvious downsides. But on the other hand, it can allow people, in principle, to focus on the content of each other's ideas instead of the identities of the people who are espousing them. And to the extent that identity drives a lot of these effects, it may also allow people to escape the peer pressure that might make them uncomfortable supporting or even entertaining alternative viewpoints online. And so what we wanted to do was create a platform. Here we called it Discuss It, because we didn't want to cue politics. And essentially what we did is recruit a large group of people to complete a survey about their views and a survey about immigration and gun control in particular. And then we invited half of them to, quote, try out a new social media platform where they would discuss anonymously with other users important issues. And in that condition, people were sent an invite code, which unbeknownst to them, paired them with a member of the other party to discuss either immigration or gun control for about an hour. And the study also has a placebo condition where people wrote essays about immigration or gun control. And I'm running out of time, so I won't go into a lot of the details, but essentially it was a chat platform where people were given very little instruction about how to behave. And yet, somewhat surprisingly, as we sent this study into the field, we discovered that the effective conversation on depolarization, the anonymous conversations, was strongly depolarizing. So this is a depolarizing index that combines both ideological and affective measures of depolarization. And what we see is about a 0.4 standard deviation increase among people who participated in the chat, an anonymous chat app. And interestingly, the effects by party were very different. The size of the treatment effect for Republicans was about 6 times that of the effect for Democrats, suggesting that perhaps anonymous conversation is even more important for Republicans, perhaps because the cost of avoiding the orthodoxy of the party, which has a much more uniform platform, or perhaps stronger norms against going against the platform, might be stronger when Republicans are placed in anonymous conversations with Democrats. So there's the book, and here's how to get a hold of me. And I'd love to discuss any or all of this. The public stuff, I can go into much greater detail on the methods. And thanks again to everyone for coming. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for this presentation. We do have 2 questions by Joanna Bryson. So one was a follow-up or clarification question on the first experiment, but I think this could be applied to this second experiment as well. It's about duration of the effect. So Joanna Bryson is asking, did the effect persist? And as a follow-up, could they have been an angry response to thinking you've been trying to change your mind, given they were being paid to read the tweets? So
yeah,
this is one
sure.
question.
I don't think so, and here's why. We used seemingly unrelated recruitment dialogues for the pre-treatment survey, the experimental recruitment, and then the post-treatment survey. So in the appendix to this 2018 paper, we show that very few people seemed to move in directions that would indicate that they had become more angry. And so we can't know, obviously we can't know for certain, but if you check out the appendix, I think you might be persuaded that it doesn't seem to be the main explanation of the finding, especially because we went to great lengths to disguise the nature of the treatment. So for example, for the first week of the study, the bots were retweeting nature landscapes instead of political content. And when we recruited them, we didn't tell them that we were exposing them to political content. So a number of steps were taken to kind of reduce or minimize those experimenter effects.
Okay, thank you. I'll kind of use my role just to also ask a question about this. I was thinking, going back to your information versus identity model, thinking that in the end, political messaging also tries to maximize engagement. So in a way, politicians seems to me like behave a lot like those trolls in a way, or those extreme minorities, right? And I was thinking, could this in a way imply that the quality, so the identity model is kind of a subset of the information, or a particular case of the information model, in which simply information is just bad quality? You know what I mean? Like the content of the messaging, does it make a difference? Do you have, for example, in the experiment, I don't know, stratification on the kind of quality of the messaging and the impact on attitudes? Quality is difficult to measure, of course.
It's a good question. Yeah, it was good. That was my first response, is how do you measure quality, especially in this day and age? But, there are some interesting data points here. I mean, we did kind of try to look at different features of the text, not so much quality, but like ideological extremity, for example. So one of the neat things about having this linked data is we can train a model that detects the extremity of ideology in text based on the survey responses and then respondents' text. And we didn't see that one side seems to have more extreme language than the other. To your broader point though about quality, I think there's now in my reading of the literature 3 or 4 studies that suggest that in the US Republicans are more likely to share fake news than Democrats or misinformation. Tends to be older Republicans, it seems, at least from the browser tracking data. And there's an interesting new paper coming out in the American Political Science Review this month that looks at the kind of individual correlates or individual level correlates of people who share fake news on Twitter. And one of the findings I found most interesting about that paper is that the strongest predictor of the likelihood of sharing fake news is the strength of partisanship, suggesting that, again, I think information is being weaponized in the service of partisan warfare. Now, why are Republicans more likely to engage in that than Democrats? The author of this forthcoming paper provides, I think, an interesting explanation which is that because Republicans perceive there to be a media bias towards liberals, they think of fake news as essentially their only weapon in this online war, because there's not enough bad news about Democrats. Fake news, even though they might know it's not real, is something that they essentially weaponize. So again, the motivation seems to be identity-based, partisan warfare instead of information quality, which is obviously very concerning for a number of different reasons. But I think it underscores, again, the expressive nature of social media. And I think too often, maybe not so much academics, but certainly the public discourse, if we think of how Mark Zuckerberg thinks of Facebook or Jack Dorsey thinks of Twitter, they really still have this competition of ideas model. And I think that's really problematic when we look at it's so obvious that that's simply not what motivates people to use social media. We don't typically use, or most people don't use social media to engage in a competition of ideas.
Thank you. So we have another question by Charlotte. I don't have the surname, unfortunately. And the question is, one thing that you mentioned is that there is no reward for being moderate, which is quite true. It seems being crazy and sensational gather more engagement and popularity. Should the solution perhaps be to take away these likes features?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, it would be great if we could see the result of the Instagram studies, because Instagram, as many of you may know, rolled out, it really staggered the removal of its like feature in different countries. And so I suspect that there's some knowledge about exactly what this does inside Facebook and Instagram. It's of course extremely frustrating that we don't know, exactly what the data points are, that we can't look at the data ourselves. But I would speculate that, yeah, I think it would actually increase moderation. I think because there's a twin process. There's both the status seeking people seeking, getting that immediate sense of acceptance from a like. But then for moderates who post something moderate, the absence of likes, I think, can also have the same effect. If you ever posted something moderate online and it just gets completely ignored, you can misunderstand that as a lack of approval instead of just a lack of interest. And so I think that, but we read these cues as if they were a simple random sample of the population, right? Which of course they're not. And so, I do think it could operate on moderates as well as extremists in effective ways.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions and a handful of minutes. So I'll try to go through all of them if we have time. So sure. First of all, Mario Massone was asking if you could just put again how to contact you, like your contact information up.
Yeah, just a minute here.
Then, thank you. So then in order of, I'm just reading them in order, when we got them. So Benjamin Teinturier is asking, so hi, thank you. Were you able to identify key famous actors on the Twitter debate who were inflaming the debate? Trump, of course, but maybe also journalists. Which method did you use? If so, thank you.
Sure. We currently, this bipartisanship leaderboard kind of does the opposite. So we're trying to, rank people according to their bipartisan appeal. We do have a measure that you described, but it's not public simply because we don't want to create a competition of trolling. You know, we don't want to incentivize people to engage in more extreme behavior to see if they can become Twitter's biggest troll, right? That would be a perverse incentive. But you know, I can tell you, yes, certainly Trump is high on that list. It's a little bit distorted because for very high prominence people like Trump, sometimes the people liking his tweet might not be endorsing it, but wanting to kind of bookmark it to come back to later, or to, you know, remember or share or something like that. So there's these very high status people there's a little more noise in the measure. But, you know, you can see, you know, there are certainly accounts for which, you know, 100% of the likes are coming from co-partisans. And in fact, you know, especially when you get to that far end of the continuum, which, you know, which I showed when I mentioned the Twitter bots here, you know, when you're way over here, yeah, most of these people are in that extreme category. So, you know, there are people that wouldn't surprise you, you know, people like Ted Cruz and in the US, you know, a lot that you probably also wouldn't know too, because there are people on this list that are kind of Twitter celebrities, but don't really have any real political, you know, office or standing or kind of organizational affiliation. So it kind of runs the gamut. Oh, and the technique we used. Yeah, so basically we kind of try to estimate each person's ideology based upon patterns in who they follow and are followed by on Twitter. So that's not a perfect approximation of people's political views, right? A lot of people may follow Trump but don't like Trump. But when we compare it to tried and true measures of, you know, studying political ideology, we find that the measure recovers about 89% of the identification. And so that's the one that we use in most of the analysis, both to identify the political slant of the person, but then also to identify the political slant of the people who are liking the person's tweets.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. In the latter category, it's actually, we know their survey. We know how they've self-defined in the survey. So for the opinion leaders, there's a little more noise than there is in the liking data. Sorry.
We're getting close to 5 p.m., but I think there are two questions that I can just ask you together because they are like directly linked. So one is by Vincent Frey at the University of Groningen, so thanking you for the interesting talk. And then he's asking, you attribute the extremism bias on social media to status seeking. Can you elaborate more? Why should expect to earn someone's status from sharing extreme views rather than moderate views? Do you have, for example, liking data that supports this claim? And then Francesco Uberti, I think relatedly, is asking you, thanking you for the really engaging presentation and asking you, I was wondering whether you think social media companies may have a financial incentives to accept a polarized information environment, for example, because this might increase overall user engagement.
Yeah, first to Vincenzo's great question. The evidence we have is mostly qualitative. So, you know, there's this kind of course, among these extremists, most of the people liking the content are other extremists, in part because of what Merton, I think, called the false consensus effect. So I think social media in some sense increases the false consensus effect. So most of the data points there are, you know, they might not be the massive large end study you'd want to see, but I suspect if we did that analysis, they would be similar to what we saw in the qualitative data that's described in the 5th chapter of my book. To the point about, and sorry to be brief, Vincenzo, I would love to catch up more, by the way. The question about the corporate interests in polarization. Yeah, I think this is tricky. I mean, we'd all love to know the answer to that question. I think we should be extremely skeptical of statements that come out of Facebook. But I do think, you know, there is one data point that's noteworthy, which is, you know, Facebook's response to the boycott of advertisers. You know, it does make sense to me to some degree that advertisers don't want their content to appear alongside hate speech, for example. So I do think there is some incentive in the long term, especially insofar as social media companies are competing for users, and Facebook is losing a lot of US users lately. I don't think it's completely impossible that Facebook isn't completely focused on polarization. There's been some evidence that they've at some points taken steps to reduce polarization at a cost to their bottom line. Again, we should be very, very skeptical of any of these data points because we can't see the data points. But I do think the idea that financial incentives alone have created the problem, I think, is a real impoverished approach to the problem, because if we look at, for example, YouTube content, everybody wants to say, well, YouTube is radicalizing us, but actually, like, if we look at the supply side versus the demand side, we see that there's like another explanation is that just YouTube is tapping unmet demand for radical content. And so, we need to think about the supply side of, human behavior that I think isn't enough of the equation, because even though I would like Facebook to make many changes, I'm concerned that if we only rely on Facebook to make the changes, we won't see the scalable kind of change that would create a durable reduction in political polarization.
So thank you very much to everybody for participating, and we look forward to seeing you at future seminars.